The 13th of Hator. The banging on the door came, as always, before the dawn. Zestroya crawled out of her sleeping bag and stretched her aching spine. The pain used to be near unbearable, but using Karliana's exercises really did wonders for both the back and the knees. She put on her glasses then, pushing them as high up her nose bridge as she could, to avoid them digging into the healing scabs they left lower on the thin skin. Others were getting up as well and putting on their work clothes: shirt, vest, pants, knee protectors, boots and gloves. Geared up, they left and took their places in the counting row, where they would receive their daily tasks and food rations. The heat coming from the scorched ground could be felt through the soles of their shoes, but at least the smell was difficult to notice anymore. The one thing that remained was the constant burning in the lungs that had already taken all the elders of Mem. They walked through the narrow path between the fields of Karnin to the area they would harvest today. Assigned to her spot, Zestroya dropped to her knees and began to gently check the plants for parts ready to cut off. The guards knew she would cause no trouble, so they let her be and strolled away to keep watch over the others. The dark brown roots of Karnin were difficult to see against the burned soil, especially with Zestroya's worsening eyesight. But it was fine. She would not complain. Being assigned to work in the fields was a stroke of luck. As long as she did her job, she would be left alone, sometimes even rewarded for a good harvest with a bigger meal or even a book. Those who had to work in the mines or serve the overseers had it so much worse. Sometimes Zestroya liked to pause, for just a moment, and gaze at the great fields covered in rows of growing Karnin. Suppose there was some beauty in them, but she did it to travel back to 12 years ago, when wheat and green grass still grew on the plains. She'd been 13 when the Dardanians came, and she could still kind of remember the old man. In a way she was lucky, old enough to have these memories, yet young enough to adjust to the changes and still find some joy in her life, hard as it may be. She loosened up the collar of her shirt. Hator was awfully hot, but she couldn't overdo it. Clean and dried Karnin root could make people feel wonderful when ingested, but in its raw form, it burned skin like acid. And to some extent, that applied to the fumes coming out of the fresh cuts on the plants. Thankfully, the colder months were coming. 9th of Kiritian. Zestroya sat down on the ground behind a mound of fertilizer, hiding from the wind. To not waste much time, she got to packing up the harvested parts of Karnin into small canvas bags. But her thoughts were far from the task at hand. Every night, Karliana shared a new chapter of a story she was making up during work hours, and the last part ended on a cliffhanger that was driving Zestroya insane. What could... Ses! She jerked up as a sudden whisper from behind the mound pulled her back to the real world. Sion leaped around the pile and crouched beside her. Sion? What are you doing here? Shh! He pressed a finger to his lips. Can we talk here? Are they watching you? Of course they're watching me! Zestroya whispered in a worry mixed with anger. Why would Sion leave the mine in the middle of the day? There used to be a time when he would sneak out during work hours to try and see her, but he'd been beaten into obedience since. Something big must have happened. Otherwise he would just wait until the feeding hours to talk. What's going on? She asked. There was a cave-in. Zestroya froze. At the mines? Oh God, is everyone all right? No, Ses. Nobody's all right. What? No, They're alive, Sion cut into her sentence. But we must go, now. I can't. I must deliver at least 10 bags today, and this is not a good sector. Zestroya, I'm not joking. Come with me, it is important. He tried to grab her by the arm, but she pushed him away. No, I can't. I can't do it. I won't survive the whipping. She turned back to packing the route in hope that he would get the point and leave. The guards watching over the fields wouldn't care about the cave-in. The mine might be out of order for today, but here the work wouldn't stop. Suddenly Sion grabbed her face and pressed his lip to hers. Sestraya dropped the bag she was holding and bits of carnine spilled onto the ground. What? She mumbled out. She had had a crush on him since they were children, and yes, he still made her stomach tingly, but what? Sion looked her in the eye. Got your attention now? He didn't wait for an answer, and instead made use of her confusion. He pulled her up by the arm and dragged her quickly out of the field, glancing around to see if any of the guards spotted them. You've always been such a nerd, he said. No wonder they're not watching you. I bet you're their favorite little worker bee. What? Nerd? You're speaking nonsense. Quite the opposite. Sion was acting weird. Something was amiss. He led her into the forest, but even when they couldn't see the fields anymore, they didn't stop. Where are we going? Sestraya asked. I can't breathe. Stop. A bit further. We can't risk it. Sion rushed her, pulling her forward. The forest. Sestraya hadn't been to the forest in years. She couldn't help but look around in awe. The tree trunks around them were colored in a gradient of fire and ice. The charred part near the ever-burning ground slowly became brighter and whiter with hoarfrost as the trees climbed up towards the sky. The hounds can find us anyway, she panted out. We can't outrun them. We can't escape, Sion. Are you insane? We're not escaping. We just need a little time. He turned his head to look at her, and before she could respond, he said, Shush, don't waste your breath speaking. Keep running. They reached an old hunting pit. Sion jumped down and helped Sestraya inside. Then, at last, the hectic run stopped. Sion, what? Sestraya fell down to her knees, fighting to catch a breath and form a coherent thought. Her lungs were burning. Sion placed a hand on her shoulder and gave it a squeeze. Calm down, breathe. We are safe here. For a moment. The pit's soil walls were lined with charred remnants of tree roots. The burn went deeper than Sestraya had thought. Sion, why are we here? They will kill us. They probably already know we're gone. Ses. What? She tried to keep her voice steady. I have to tell you something. And it will be difficult to believe, but it's true. Sestraya was at a loss for words. She looked at him with her mouth slightly parted, her brow furrowed and heart racing. How would they return to Mem now? They would be punished the second they approached the guards. But maybe if they started going back now, if they explained that it was the carnine, that it muddled their minds, and they got confused, maybe the punishment wouldn't be too bad. The root did that sometimes. It could work. Wait. It was actually what happened, wasn't it? Gods. If she had just thought of it back on the field, she could have taken Sion inside somewhere, making rest clear his head, instead of following him all the way here. She was an idiot. An actual idiot. Sion, you can tell me everything in the evening, all right? She tried to reason with him. She had to convince him to listen to her, somehow. Let's go back now, though. This isn't our real life, Ses. In our real lives, the Dardanians never came, he said, deaf to her plea. What? Sion tilted his head, and a ghost of a smile appeared on his lips. His face and clothes were smudged with dirt. His hands were covered with multiple shallow cuts that would leave more of those rock-burn scars as they healed. But though he looked exhausted, he was also energized. She hadn't seen him like this for years. It's complicated, he said, but if you trust me, I will prove it to you. His words made no sense whatsoever, but what could she do? Even if it was the carnine fumes boggling his mind, if he believed that this was not a real life, he wouldn't go back to Memn. Sestraya had two options: stay here and try to help Sion get out of his haze quicker, or leave him here to sober up on his own and pray that the overseer wouldn't kill him when he returned later. As if. Fine, I trust you. What now? She had to understand his delusion to find a way to get him out of it. Lie down. I will straddle you, he said as if to warn her, but some warning that needed. Sestraea nodded and he did as promised, then pressed one hand to her temple and the other above her heart. His body was emanating more heat than the warm soil she lay on, and Sestraea again found it difficult to breathe. And now what? She asked again. Don't worry about it. You won't feel a thing. That sounded a touch ominous. She looked Sion in the eye and he met her gaze with a smile. His arm resting on her chest, pushed down, and suddenly the words skipped a beat. Sestraea blinked several times, dizzy. Sion moved his hand from her temple to her cheek. It was so warm. And then a feeling overtook her that could not be compared to anything. Her mind exploded with memories, images, feelings. All the current sensations vanished. The heat of the ground, her body bent upwards in shock, the weight of Sion pressing her down, and the protective hand slipped underneath her head. Sestraea's brain was under assault. Sion. Sion! He pressed a hand over her lips. Shush, we don't want to be found. Sion, she tried to shout his name through his fingers. I know. Let it. Little by little, everything began to fall into place, form coherent chains of events, thoughts, experiences, and finally separated into two worlds, two lives, two sets of memories, the last of which were here and now. Seeing her relax, Sion got off of her and pulled her up to a sitting position. Sestraea looked at him and then, in a surge of emotions, launched herself at him and caught him in the tightest hug. Sion's arms wrapped around her, and for a moment they just stayed like that. Either they both now had gone insane, or Sion's unbelievable story was true. This wasn't their reality. Sion, what's going on? She asked. The past was changed. You mean our memories? But everything here... No, Sess. The past itself. Everything we remember did happen. Our real life, and then this blunder. That's one way to describe it. Sestraea let him out of her embrace and tried to smile. But how is that even possible? She asked. The mages destroyed every sliver of time change related techniques forever ago. And as far as we know, no one has even managed to make any of them work ever. Sion raised his shoulders. I don't know, but it happened. We are the proof of it. It must be some kind of delusion. That's more plausible, isn't it? And what? This is the only life we've had. Everything else is a fabrication of our minds. He looked her in the eye and asked, Are you willing to believe that? It was common knowledge that once upon a time there were beings capable of bending and twisting time. The elementals, several hundred mortal avatars left behind by the four gods that had created this world. But that was centuries ago, and these creatures had long been extinct. The knowledge of time manipulation was presumed to be gone with them, and all that was left were legends, novels, and cautionary tales. And yet here she was, ready to believe that somehow some human had found a way to do it. Because otherwise, this reality would be true. And it couldn't be. We are 3 years earlier, Sestraea counted and frowned. The last day of the real life, I remember was the 22nd of Ahnar, 247, right? Yes, that's actually key, but we should move now. I'll explain everything soon. How do you know anything anyway? Have you had a third secret life where you studied time travel? Sion snorted. I missed you, nerd. And no, Professor Hamis told me what we need to know. Wait, Professor? What does he have to do with any of it? Sion rushed Sestroya to stand up. Grabbing the roots sticking out of the pit, they cautiously made their way out, listening for the sounds of the incoming pursuit. For now everything was quiet, but that wouldn't last. As they moved on, Sion recounted the events of the cave-in. Professor Hamis, hit by a rock, for a moment was clinically dead. Though the others managed to resuscitate him, in that moment he reconnected with the original timeline and awoke knowing the truth. He then stopped Sion's heart for long enough to allow him, too, to see through the spell. "Why didn't he come with you?" Sestroya asked. "Is he waking up the others?" "No." "Sion?" "He didn't make it." Sestroya halted in her tracks. "Don't." Sion took her by the elbow, not letting her stop. "It won't matter. We will turn it back, he'll be alive and grumpy again," he said. "None of this will be real, Ses. Come now, we must find ground zero of the spell. If we go into the court, the hounds will lose our scent and the guards will have to assume we made our way north, trying to flee to Triumph. The new border was heavily guarded, but they wouldn't be the first to try crossing it regardless. Desperate people were reckless. Yeah, that would make sense. So what is the stupid direction we're going instead? Overseer's sleeping quarters? Could be. Could be.